For this morning, we've been going through a series the past several Sundays called Win Your War Within. Win Your War Within. It was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who said that the divide between good and evil runs not between political lines or between countries and continents, but it's a line that runs between the human heart. It's a line that runs between every one of us. And we know that to be true. We've experienced that. We feel that war within. In thousands of years before he ever came along, Paul, the apostle, wrote in Romans 7 and described his own struggle with that war within. That sometimes because of this war that's waging inside, he does the things that he doesn't want to do, and there's this battle going back and forth. And he says, who can save me? Who can save me from this body of death? And he says, thanks be to God who gives us the victory through Jesus Christ. And that's what this series has been all about, that struggle, that war within, and how we battle against flesh inside of us and in the spirit above us, and we feel that divide. And the answer, the solution, though the world may laugh, is in fact Christ. And thanks be to God for that. And so 2 weeks ago, we talked about really the root of it all, and that's pride. And then last Sunday, we talked about gluttony. And then this morning, we're going to talk about greed. Win your war with greed. And I want to start just by saying I want to go ahead and just disagree with what this guy has to say. This is from the movie Wall Street. He says, the point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better term, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms, he says, greed for life, for money, for love, for knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind. And greed, you mark my words, will not only save our corporation, he says, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much. Now, I hope that I haven't lost anybody yet. I hope we're all on the same page. We all, I think, disagree with this statement. Greed is not good. But I think this statement does tell us something, or maybe reveal to us something about what's going on within our world and what's going on within our own heart. And maybe we could even say growing within our own heart. And here's what I mean by that. We are living in by far the most prosperous place and time in all of human history. And by that, I don't mean specifically Bowling Green, Kentucky, but we know that the time that we're living in is unique. That over the past couple centuries, especially over the past century, we have advanced in a way that the world hasn't really seen before. We have transportation, personal transportation that can get us around anywhere we want. We have access to medicine and healthcare unlike really ever before. We have any food that we want really at our fingertips upon our demand, and any entertainment we want at the click of a button. And all these things, they're not bad in and of themselves, right? But it does show that we are living in a time that, for all practical purposes, we could say we're really living like kings. And of course, there's always been wealthy. There's always been people who are abundant and well off. But we're living in a time where wealth, or at least a time and place where we have an exorbitant amount of wealth. And it hasn't always been this way, right? I was just talking with my granny. I don't know what people call grandparents here. I say granny. I was talking with my granny yesterday, and she was talking about what it was like growing up just a few decades ago. and how she didn't really have much. She grew up where she had maybe one dress and a few change of clothes. She worked hard. The whole family worked hard for the food that they brought in directly by their own sweat and work of their hands. And it was special to get to go to a place with air conditioning. And now today, some of those things we just don't even think about. We take for granted. She didn't have much at all. And I realized that there may be people here or people that you know, there are people in our world today that still, they don't have much. And maybe at different times in our lives, we feel that way. We feel like we just really don't have much. But here's what my granny had to say about that I thought was interesting. So I was sort of almost, I guess, complaining to her about the problem of greed and covetousness in our world and the way that causes so many problems. And she kind of paused and she said, well, you know, it may be true that we're living in a more prosperous time than ever before. But you know, the problem of greed has been here forever. And she's right. Every society, rich or poor, has struggled deeply with the problem of greed. Every culture, every place and time has experienced that. That quote calls it the evolutionary spirit of mankind. I, of course, disagree with the theory of evolution, but you know, the way that greed has overtaken the hearts of people, it's not shocking to wonder why people look around at the way that greed has taken over and say, you know, maybe that is how we came about. The strong eating the weak through greed, through covetousness, through getting what's mine and gaining for myself and rising to the top and prospering by my own greed and gain. And here's why it's so dangerous. I think there are really two reasons. First, greed by itself is bad, but it's really a gateway to almost every other sin. You notice there he says that greed in all its forms, greed for life, for money, for love, for knowledge, greed comes in all kinds of forms. And isn't that true? Greed is shape-shifting. It takes on any number of forms throughout our life, and it can infect us in any number of ways. My granny, she described it as like an octopus. It's got tentacles that reach into every part of our life and grip every part of our life. That's what greed does. It is a gateway to other things, and always the personal gain of greed, it comes at a great cost to someone else. And we may not ever see that cost, but always it comes at a great cost for someone else. Think about Ahab in Naboth's vineyard, right? Or David in Bathsheba. Ahab, he covets that field. He's just got to have it. He's a king who's got it all. He has everything, and yet he looks at this field and he says, I've just got to have this one more thing. Or David, he's risen to the top. He's united Israel in a way that they had never been before, and he's the man after God's own heart, and yet, as this king who has it all, he covets the one thing he can't have. And it comes at that cost. For Ahab, it was the cost of Naboth, the injustice that went on there. For David, it was the cost of Uriah, among others. Our personal want and wishes, this greed that has infected all of us, it always comes at a significant cost for somebody else. And while it starts with the individual, it has a perpetuating effect that seeps into and permeates whole families and societies and our whole world. And as it takes these different forms, as we find this need for more It leads to lying, to corruption, to adultery and injustice, to hypocrisy and cover-up, and to murder. And that's the cost of greed. And so, of course, we all agree that greed is not good. Greed is like this venom that has been coursing throughout mankind since the moment that Adam and Eve took of that fruit in the garden. Greed is not good, but to say that greed is bad is an understatement. And here's the worst part, I think. I think the worst part about greed is we see it, we're frustrated by it, we see all of its corrosive effects in the world around us, and we all agree that somebody should do something about it. But the worst part is that while greed is so apparent in other people, we almost always fail to see it in ourselves and in our own lives and in our own hearts. And we'll consider that thought more in a moment. But if greed had such a tight grip on the man after God's own heart, then don't you think it would be a little naive or maybe even a little bit foolish to think that it doesn't at least have a finger around our own? And so that's the problem of greed. And so what do we do about it? How do we solve this problem of greed? And if you want, you can make your way over to Luke chapter 12. That's where we'll be for the rest of this lesson, in Luke 12. And there in Luke 12, I think Jesus offers us an answer. He sort of goes about it in three ways. First, he describes greed, what it is, what it looks like, how it works. And then he describes what's really going on behind it. And then finally, he offers a solution, how we move beyond it, how we overcome this problem of greed. And it all starts with this. There in Luke 12 and verse 13, it says, someone in the crowd. And I want you to picture this crowd. Just before this, in verse 1, it talks about just how full this crowd was, that many thousands had gathered, and it was so packed that people were literally trampling one another to get to Jesus, to hear him speak, or maybe to heal their loved one, or whatever it might have been. But the crowds are pressing in, and they're trampling over one another. And then this someone in the crowd speaks up in the middle of Jesus' teaching, and he says, "Teacher," or "Rabbi, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And so here's this strange moment. That would be like somebody, if y'all just interrupted me right now and said, "Hey, I've got this question, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." You can kind of picture what's going on here. That would be kind of an odd moment. But Jesus, he stops his teaching to address this man, and he says, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" So Jesus starts by saying, look, this isn't the kind of thing that I'm here for. This is not what I'm concerned about. This is not what I have come to do. And then he continues on, and he turns not just to this man, but then to the rest of the crowd, and he said to them, "Take care," or "watch out, and be on your guard against every form of greed. For," he says, "one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." That word, greed or covetousness here, it literally means a thirst for more. A thirst for more. It's this insatiable desire for more and more material things. And that thirst for more can take on, he says, any number of forms. It might look like, you remember maybe two different stories. It might look like the story of the prodigal son who goes out and squanders his estate with reckless living. Or it might look like the rich young ruler who just can't part with his possessions. He's got this tight grip on what belongs to him and what he thinks is mine. But in whatever form it takes, whether it's holding tightly to what we have or this excessive pursuit of pleasure, in whatever form it takes, it really all comes down to the second part of that statement. The reason why we thirst for more, the reason why we chase after the abundance of possessions, is because we think that that's where life is found. We think that if I can just get this next thing, if I can just get this dream job or car or house or whatever it might be, if I can just arrive at this point in life, then I'll know what it really means to live. But Jesus, he says, life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And then he goes on to tell a story to really drive this home. He says to the crowd, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. Now, I love this question that he asks. He looks out at the plentiful harvest that is before him, and he asks the question, what should he do? And that's the question that we should ask all of ourselves. When we look out at the abundance that we have and the time and place that we live in, we should be asking this question, what should I do with all this? But here's what he thinks of, and you can kind of hear the excitement in his voice. He says, I'll do this. So there's this kind of aha moment. He says, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and I'll build up bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Then I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So he has this aha moment. I know exactly what I'm going to do. And I want us to think, remember, he's trying to describe what greed really is and what it looks like, how it works inside of us. And here's what's going on with this rich man. He looks out at the plentiful harvest. He looks out at this field that's produced plentifully. And then he looks off into the future. And he imagines what his life could look like. And he imagines this moment where he says to his soul, right, I finally arrived. I've finally figured out what life is all about. And greed works the same way within every one of us, right? We look out at what we have been given or what we feel like we've earned or what we feel like is rightfully ours. And then we look off into the future and we envision and we imagine what our life could look like if we just leverage everything the right way, if we just pull all the right strings, then I could finally arrive at the point in life that I really want. And our vision is really the same. Maybe we don't put it that same way where we relax, eat, drink, and be merry, but we all want that moment, right? Where we want that say to your soul kind of moment, where we say to our soul, man, I finally made it. I finally have this thing. I finally reached this point in life, and now I feel like I've finally arrived. I can rest and relax and just enjoy what's in front of me. And so we could think about it like this. The rich man, he has this aha moment. I know what I'll do. And then he has this moment where he says, I finally made it. He looks out at the plentiful harvest and then he looks off into the future. He envisions what it could be like. And this is the life that he desires to live. This say to your soul moment, relax, eat, drink, and be merry. And as he envisions that, as he desires this next best thing, you remember what happens in the story. That night, God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you've prepared, whose will they be?" And then Jesus says, "So is the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." And this is really the fundamental problem of greed. It's a thirst for more. It's this pursuit of the abundance of possessions, this vision that we have of our future and what it could look like with all of our wants and wishes at the center of it. But what it really all comes down to is storing up treasures for ourselves at the cost of failing to be rich toward God. One theologian put it this way. He said, "There is within the human heart a tough, fibrous root of fallen life whose nature is to possess, always to possess. It covets things with a deep and fierce passion." He says the pronouns my and mine look innocent enough in print, but their constant and universal use is significant. They express the real nature of the old Adamic man better than 1,000 volumes of theology could do. They are verbal symptoms of our deep disease. The roots of our hearts have grown down into things, and we dare not pull up one rootlet lest we die. Things, he says, have become necessary. A development never originally intended. God's gifts now take the place of God, and the whole course of nature is upset by the monstrous substitution. That's our problem. That's the problem of greed. It's this tough, fibrous root that's grown down deep inside of us, and it's this moment where we feel like it's necessary. And it's when we have become so dependent and so trusting of the gifts that we've forgotten the giver, we've forgotten the one who's given us all things. And as a result, just as Adam and Eve took in the garden, as we continue that coveting nature, time and time again, the whole course of nature is upset by this awful, monstrous substitution. And so what is greed? Greed is that thirst for more. It's that desire to possess. It's that vision of the future of what we want our lives to look like. Or as Jesus put it, it's storing up treasures for ourselves. But then Jesus goes on to describe what's really going on behind it. Because like most sins, it's never really just these problems that are going on the surface or maybe just a few levels down. There's usually always something that's lying behind it, a sort of primal motive and instinct and desire that we have, or a need that we have, that we're redirecting from God and placing in something else. And Jesus realizes that, and he wants to drive down to the heart of the issue. And so he says in the next verse, therefore. He tells them this story about the rich man, and then he says, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life. So Jesus, he's back around to this idea about what life is and what it really means to live. He says, don't be anxious about your life, what you will eat, or your body, what you will put on. For he says, life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. So the man asks this question. Jesus tells this story as a response about this rich man who builds bigger and better barns. But then it's like in this moment, Jesus pivots. And as he warns them about, hey, watch out, because greed can take hold of every one of us. And as he warns them that life is not found in the abundance of possessions, and he tells this story, it's like Jesus pivots in this moment to say, but you know what the real problem is? The real problem is that you are so afraid. You are so afraid. You're so anxious and worried about life. You're worried that you're not going to have enough things in this life, or if you don't have these things, you're going to miss out on what it means to really live. And that fear, that anxiety and worry about life produces in us cultivates in us a spirit of greed and covetousness where we feel like we're never going to have enough. This problem of scarcity where we feel like this is the thing that drives us to get more and more and more because I'm worried if I don't have this thing, I'm going to miss out. And isn't that so true? Can't you feel that that's the way that greed works inside of all of us? It's not just that we want or desire these things. It's that we feel like we need them. In fact, we even say that, right? I've got to have it. I've got to have this thing. Ahab, I've got to have this vineyard. David, I've got to have this woman. I've got to have this one more thing. And so here's this problem that's growing inside every one of us. This thirst for more and more, because if we don't have that, then we don't have life. But Jesus says to the crowd, look, life is so much more than this. And so verse 29, he says, do not seek what you are to eat or what you are to drink, and nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. So all the world, all mankind from the moment Adam and Eve took in the garden, and every person, society, and culture and nation ever since, we've all been driven by this anxiety and fear and worry that we're not going to have enough. And that has created the consumerist society that we live in today. And it's led to all kinds of injustice and all kinds of corrosive effects in our world. And the craziest part of it all is that this whole time, he says, your Father has known and desired and wanted to give you these things. And so that's our problem. That's greed and how it works, and what's really behind it, this motive of fear and anxiety that I'm not going to have enough. And so finally, Jesus offers a solution. Verse 31, he says this. He says, instead of having this insatiable desire for more and more stuff for myself, instead of being driven by this fear that I'm not going to have enough, instead, seek his kingdom. And these things will be added to you. And then he says, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So what's the solution? We see greed, what it is and how it works. We see what's really going on, but behind it, this anxiety and fear of not having enough. But what's the solution? What is Jesus really saying here? Well, I think it starts with this. If we're going to overcome greed, we first have to do something about that problem of fear. And that means instead of being filled with worry and anxiety about our life and building up your own kingdom, we have to fill ourselves with something else. And we didn't have time to read this part before, but just before this, Jesus, he says to them, as he looks out at this crowd, he says, hey, look at the sparrows. They don't have storehouses or barns like that rich man, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Or look at the lilies of the field. They don't toil or spin or work and work and work, but your Father has clothed them with more glory than Solomon. And so he says, if that's true, if your Father cares for you and has provided for you in all these ways, then how much more will he provide for you? And it's like he's saying, instead of looking off into the future and imagining what could become of my life and being so worried about all the things that I might miss out on if I don't possess these things. What if instead of worrying about that, I live in the moment and I look around at the way that God provides for the world and for the people around me and for myself, and instead of being filled with a heart of worry and fear, I'm filled with gratitude at the abundance of blessings that God has showered upon us. What if instead of being driven by this spirit of greed and covetousness, I have a spirit of gratitude where I look at all the ways that God has provided for me every day up into this point, and I walk in faith moving forward and in trust moving forward that He'll provide for me the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that. That I trust in the God who has been so gracious to give me all things. And why? Why does He give us these things? Not because we've worked hard enough or that we've earned it ourselves, but because He says it's His good pleasure. It's His delight. It's His joy to give us these things, to give us the kingdom. Like a good father, He delights to give us all things. And so to overcome greed, I think it starts by being filled not with fear and worry about never having enough in life, but with gratitude, realizing all the things that He's given to us. But what about this kingdom that He talks about? Because we might not all be building bigger barns like the man in that story, but we all are building up our own kingdoms, right? We all have this kingdom that we're working on, and that we think when we're done, we'll find the security and the happiness and the rest and the peace that we're all looking for in life. And just like that rich man, we imagine that as soon as we have it, then we'll have finally arrived. And like Dr. Phil would say, how's that working out for you? Right? That only causes more stress, more worry, more greed. And like the man in the story, it leaves us alone with no one to even pass it on to. And so what if instead He says, we seek His kingdom? And He describes what that looks like. He finally says in verse 33, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For, He says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Here's, I think, what it all comes down to. It's not just about being filled with gratitude, but overflowing with generosity. That's the life that Jesus is calling us to be the kind of people who are looking out at the abundance of God's blessings, and we're filled with gratitude, and then we're overflowing with generosity. And that doesn't mean that Jesus has called every one of us to live a life of poverty. But I do think that the call for every one of us could be put like this. I think Jesus is calling every one of us to do really two things. First of all, He's calling us to use the treasures God has given me to show others how much God treasures them. That's what Jesus is calling every one of us to use the treasures that we've been given to show others how much God treasures them. See, the rich man in this story, he looked out at that plentiful harvest and he asked that question, what should I do? And that's the question that every one of us should ask, to look out at what we've been given and say, what should I do with this? What should I do with what God has placed in my hand? And instead of looking off into the future and imagining a world where all of our wants and wishes are met, where our own desires are at the center of it, what if instead of imagining all that, we imagine all the ways that that we could use what God has blessed us with to be a blessing to the people around us, to our family, to our community, to our church, to this world? What if we ask the question, how can I use the treasures God has given me to show others how much God has treasured them? And that's what it means to seek His kingdom. That's what it means to be rich toward God and what it means to store up treasure in heaven. And here's what I love about that. What that means is that I don't have to be rich toward God. I don't have to have very much to be rich and to share my abundance with other people. I could be the widow with 2 mites. I could be like my granny who hardly had anything growing up, but who gave everything away. I don't have to be rich toward God. And this is a life that Jesus is calling us to, where we look out at God's blessings and then off into the future, and we imagine not just what our life could look like, but what this whole world could be like if we all chose to live just like this, where we use what God has given me to show others how much God treasures them. And then the last thing is this. The reason that we do this, the reason why we invest in other people and not in ourselves, is because finally, the value of a life is measured not by how much is gained, but by how much is given away. That's what it really all comes down to. The rich man was so worried about life. And Jesus looks out at this crowd and he sees that same worry and concern and anxiety within all of them. But Jesus is telling them, look, the value of a life is measured not by how much is gained, but by how much is given away. And here's why I know that that's true. The people that we admire the most, the people that we most want to be like, they're not the rich and wealthy. They're not the people of Wall Street. They're not the top 1%. They're the people who made you feel valued. They're the people who you knew really cared. They're the people who treasured you. And who, in whatever they had, or maybe in what little they had, treated you like royalty because they really cared that much. And that's true of the people that we admire the most, and that's true of the person that we admire the most. See, we said before that greed and personal gain always comes at a great cost. And sometimes we don't even see it. Sometimes we don't see the damaging and corrosive effects of our own personal desire for more and more stuff, but it always comes at a cost. Whether we can see it or not, it comes at a very high price. But have you ever thought about what your greed costs God? Jesus, although he existed in the form of God, didn't regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. He emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant. And being found in human form, Paul says he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. That was the price, that was the cost of our greed and our covetousness. And you know what? It was God's good pleasure to do it. It was God's grace. It was God's delight. It was God's joy to come down and empty himself and to take on the form of a servant. Why? Because he treasured us. Because he valued you. And he realized that the value of a life is measured not by how much is gained, but how much is given away. And no one gave up more than him. And so, like Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, the one who tries to find their life will lose it. When we try to seek out our own life in abundance and build up our own kingdom and pursue the abundance of possessions and that thirst for more and more and more, it's just like that mirage in the desert. We chase after it and we always come up empty. The one who tries to find their life will lose it, but he says, the one who loses his life for my sake will find it. And in him, we find that life. We find that security. We find that identity and hope and meaning and vision for the future and the life that we've all been searching for. And in him, we find that life forever. It may be this morning that you're here and you're among us and you've thirsted after the things of this world and you've searched for the security and the satisfaction and the identity and hope and all these things, and maybe you've realized that all those things come up empty. Or maybe you have wandered off again and you, after coming to the endless fountain of Christ, you've wandered away. And we want you to come back. Christ is calling all of us to find life and to find it abundantly in him. And so if we can help you in any way this morning, we ask that you come now as together we stand and sing.